The whiskey burned going down, but Dalton Brooks barely felt it as he stared at the empty church pews that had witnessed his humiliation not once, but twice. 3 years had passed since the second time he stood at that altar alone, watching the door that never opened. And now, at 32 years old, he had convinced himself that some men were just meant to walk through life without a partner. Delta, Colorado in 1885 was a growing town nestled in the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, where cattle ranchers and fruit farmers were starting to carve out prosperous lives from the fertile valley. Dalton had built his ranch from nothing after the war, turning a small homestead into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. His Hereford cattle grazed on thousands of acres, his barns were full, and his bank account was healthier than most men could dream of. But none of it meant much when he returned each night to an empty house. The first time had been in 1880. Mary Ellen Hutchinson had been the banker's daughter, beautiful and refined, with blonde curls and a smile that made Dalton believe in second chances after the hell he had seen during the war. They had courted for 6 months, and when he proposed, she said yes without hesitation. The wedding was planned for a bright Saturday in June. Dalton stood at the altar in his best suit, his hands sweating, his heart pounding with anticipation. The church filled with neighbors and friends. The reverend took his place. The pianist began to play, but Mary Ellen never walked through those doors. Her father found her room empty, a note on the pillow explaining that she had run off with a traveling merchant who promised her a life in San Francisco, far from the dust and hard work of ranch life. The second time had been worse, because Dalton had thought he was being smarter, more careful. Catherine Wells was a widow who had moved to Delta after her husband died in a mining accident up in Leadville. She was practical, hardworking, and seemed to appreciate the life Dalton could offer. They courted for nearly a year before he proposed again. In 1882, he found himself at that same altar, older and more cautious, but still hoping. This time Catherine made it to the church. She made it all the way to the entrance. Dalton could see her through the open doors, standing in her wedding dress, her face pale. Then she turned and ran, leaving nothing but the echo of her footsteps and later, a tearful apology delivered through a friend. She could not go through with marrying a man she did not love, no matter how good he was on paper. After that, Dalton stopped trying. He focused on his ranch, on breeding better cattle, on expanding his land. He became known as a fair employer, a shrewd businessman, and a man who kept to himself. The people of Delta whispered about him with a mixture of pity and respect. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was too particular. Most just felt sorry for him. It was a cold February morning in 1885 when everything changed. Dalton was in town picking up supplies when he heard the commotion near the train station. A small crowd had gathered, and he could hear raised voices. His foreman, an older man named Pete, was standing nearby, and Dalton walked over to see what the fuss was about. "What is going on?" Dalton asked. Pete shook his head. "New schoolteacher arrived on the morning train. Seems the boarding house owner is refusing to let her stay. Says she did not know the new teacher would be an unmarried woman traveling alone, and she runs a respectable establishment." Dalton moved closer and saw a young woman standing beside a worn trunk and 2 carpetbags. She could not have been more than 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a simple hat, and a face that showed both exhaustion and determination. Her brown traveling dress was dusty from the journey, but she held herself with a straight spine, her chin lifted despite the humiliation of the very public rejection. "I have my contract right here," the young woman was saying, her voice steady despite the tremor Dalton could detect underneath. "The school board hired me. I have every right to be here." Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, crossed her arms over her ample chest. "I do not care what the school board did. I am not having an unmarried woman of questionable character staying under my roof." Questionable character. The young woman's voice rose slightly. "I am a certified teacher from a respectable academy in St. Louis. I have references from 3 ministers and 2 school superintendents. What exactly about my character is questionable?" "Any woman who travels across the country alone is not the kind of woman I want in my establishment," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "You should have stayed where you belonged." Dalton felt something stir in his chest, an old anger at injustice that he had not felt in years. He stepped forward before he could think better of it. "Mrs. Henderson, I am sure you do not mean to leave this woman stranded with nowhere to go." The boarding house owner turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Brooks, this is not your concern. I run my establishment as I see fit." "The school board hired her," Dalton said evenly, "which means the town needs her. You cannot just leave her in the street because she had the courage to travel here to help our children get an education." The young woman turned to look at him, and Dalton found himself meeting a pair of green eyes that seemed to see straight through him. There was intelligence there, and pride, and something that looked like barely contained fury at the situation she found herself in. "I appreciate your support, sir, but I can handle this myself," she said. "I can see that," Dalton replied, "but it does not hurt to have someone remind folks of their basic decency." Mrs. Henderson bristled. "Now see here, Dalton Brooks, I will not be lectured about decency by a man who has been left at the altar twice. Perhaps if you understood anything about respectability, you would not be in the position you are in." The words hung in the air like a slap. Dalton felt his jaw tighten, but before he could respond, the young woman spoke up, her voice sharp as broken glass. "What an extraordinarily cruel thing to say to someone trying to help. If that is the level of Christian charity in this town, perhaps I should get back on the next train." "Perhaps you should," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "Now hold on," came another voice. Thomas Pritchard, who owned the general store and served on the school board, pushed through the small crowd. "Miss Ortiz, I apologize for this welcome. We hired you in good faith, and we will find you suitable accommodations. Miss Ortiz can stay in the teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse," Dalton heard himself say. "I know it has been used for storage, but I can have my men clean it out today. It has a good stove, a bed frame, and with some work it will be perfectly suitable." Thomas looked relieved. "That is a fine idea, Dalton. Miss Ortiz, would that be acceptable to you?" The young woman looked between them, clearly weighing her limited options. "Is the cottage secure, private?" "It is," Thomas assured her. "It was built for the teacher 10 years ago, but we have not had cause to use it since most of our teachers have been married men who had their own homes. I can have my wife bring over some linens and supplies." "Then I accept," Miss Ortiz said. "Thank you for your assistance, both of you." She looked directly at Dalton when she said it, and he felt that strange stirring in his chest again. "I will get my wagon and load up your things," Dalton said. "Then we can get the cottage sorted out." An hour later, Dalton was sweeping out the small cottage while Miss Ortiz stood in the doorway, surveying what would be her new home. The building was only one room with a small attached washroom, but it was solidly built, with a good wood stove, a window that let in plenty of light, and enough space for a bed, a table, and a few chairs. "It is not much," Dalton said, pausing in his sweeping. "It is mine, which makes it a palace," Miss Ortiz replied. She had removed her hat, and Dalton could see that her hair was a rich auburn color, with hints of red that caught the light. "I have been staying in other people's spaces for so long, I had almost forgotten what it felt like to have privacy. "Where did you come from?" Dalton asked, then immediately felt like he was prying. "I apologize, that is not my business. St. Louis most recently," she said, stepping inside and running her hand along the window frame. "But I grew up in Santa Fe. My father was Anglo. My mother was from a Spanish family that had been in New Mexico for generations. When my father died, my mother's family made it clear that I was not entirely welcome. Half-breeds rarely are." She said it matter-of-factly without self-pity, but Dalton could hear the old pain underneath. "That must have been difficult," he said quietly. "It was. But it taught me to rely on myself." She turned to look at him, and again he felt the weight of those green eyes. "Why did you help me out there? You do not know me." Dalton leaned on the broom handle, considering the question. "I do not like seeing people treated unfairly. And I know what it is like to be the subject of town gossip." A small smile crossed her face. "Mrs. Henderson's comment about the altar, that was unnecessarily vicious." "It was also true," Dalton said. "I have been left at the altar twice. It is not a secret." "And do you deserve to be mocked for it?" Miss Ortiz asked, tilting her head. "I suppose I was a fool for trying twice." "Or you were brave enough to hope twice," she said. "That takes more courage than most people have." Something in Dalton's chest loosened at those words, like a knot he had not realized he was carrying suddenly came undone. He cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I should finish cleaning," he said. "My men will bring over a load of firewood and help get the bed set up properly." "Mr. Brooks," Miss Ortiz said, and he paused. "Thank you, truly. I do not know what I would have done without your help." "Anyone would have done the same," he said, "but they did not," she pointed out. "You did. That matters." Over the next few weeks, Dalton found reasons to be in town more often than usual. He told himself it was because he needed to check on the lumber order for the new barn, or because he had business with Thomas Pritchard, or because his favorite horse needed new shoes from the blacksmith. But the truth was, he found himself looking for glimpses of Grace Ortiz. She had settled into the teacher's cottage and into her role at the school with a determination that impressed everyone. The children loved her because she was strict but fair, and she had a way of making even arithmetic seem interesting. The parents respected her because their children were actually learning, and the town gossips, despite themselves, had to admit that she was doing an excellent job. Dalton learned more about her in pieces, through conversations at the general store and observations of his own. She was 26 years old, had attended a teacher's college in St. Louis, and had taught at 3 different schools before coming to Delta. She read voraciously, borrowing books from anyone who would lend them. She had a dry sense of humor that caught people off guard. And she was fiercely independent in a way that both impressed and worried the more traditional townspeople. Their paths crossed naturally, because Delta was small enough that everyone eventually ran into everyone else. Dalton would tip his hat when they passed on the street, and she would nod politely in return. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather or the condition of the roads. It was all perfectly proper and completely unsatisfying. Then came the incident with the Martin boys. They were 3 brothers, aged 12, 14, and 16, from a ranch family known for being rough around the edges. The oldest, Jack, had decided that a woman teacher was not worthy of respect, and he made it his mission to make Grace's life difficult. He talked back in class, encouraged his brothers to do the same, and one day threw an eraser at Grace's head when she turned to write on the board. Grace sent all 3 boys home with a note to their father. That evening after school, Frank Martin showed up at the cottage, drunk and angry, shouting that no half-breed woman was going to discipline his sons. He pounded on Grace's door, demanding she come out and apologize. Dalton was riding past on his way home when he heard the commotion. He dismounted quickly and crossed to where Frank was making a scene. "Frank, you need to go home and sleep this off," Dalton said firmly. "Stay out of this, Brooks," Frank slurred. "This is between me and that woman who thinks she can tell my boys what to do." "Your boys attend her school, which means she has every right to discipline them when they misbehave," Dalton said. "Now go home before you do something you will regret." "Or what?" Frank sneered. "You think you can take me?" Dalton had not been in a fight in years, but his body remembered the training from his army days. When Frank took a swing at him, he ducked easily and caught the older man in a hold that immobilized him without causing real harm. "I am taking you to the sheriff," Dalton said calmly. "You can sleep it off in a cell." As Dalton marched Frank down the street, Grace emerged from her cottage, her face pale but composed. "Is he gone?" "He will be spending the night as a guest of the county," Dalton assured her. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "This is not the first time an angry parent has shown up. It probably will not be the last." "That does not make it acceptable," Dalton said. He wanted to stay to make sure she really was all right, but he had a belligerent drunk to deliver to the sheriff. "Will you be safe tonight?" "I have a pistol," Grace said, gesturing toward the cottage. "And I know how to use it. My father made sure of that." Dalton nodded, impressed despite himself. "I will check on you tomorrow." "That is not necessary," Grace started to say, but Dalton was already leading Frank away. The next morning, Dalton showed up at the cottage with a new lock for her door. Grace opened the door looking tired, dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had not slept well. "I thought you might want something sturdier," Dalton said, holding up the heavy brass lock. "If you will allow me to install it." Grace looked at the lock, then at him, and something in her expression softened. "Come in. I just made coffee." While Dalton installed the new lock, they talked in a way they had not before. Grace told him about growing up in Santa Fe, about her father who had been a surveyor and her mother who had taught her to read in both English and Spanish. She talked about the loneliness of being caught between two worlds, never quite belonging in either. She described the relief of finding teaching, of discovering something she was good at that gave her purpose and a place in the world. Dalton found himself telling her about his own past, about fighting in the war and coming home to nothing, about building his ranch from scratch through sheer stubbornness and long hours. He even found himself talking about the 2 failed weddings, something he never discussed with anyone. "They were not right for you," Grace said simply when he finished the story. "That is painful, but it is also a gift. You did not end up in a miserable marriage." "Sometimes I think a miserable marriage might be better than no marriage at all," Dalton admitted. "No," Grace said firmly. "I promise you it would not be. I have seen too many women trapped in marriages that slowly kill their spirits. Being alone is hard, but it is honest. It is real." "Is that why you never married?" Dalton asked, then immediately regretted the forward question. "I am sorry. I should not have asked that." "It is all right," Grace said. She poured him a cup of coffee and handed it to him. "I never married because no one ever asked. Men are intimidated by educated women, I think, or at least by women who do not fit neatly into the role they expect. I am too independent, too outspoken, too obviously mixed. I make people uncomfortable." "You do not make me uncomfortable," Dalton said, and realized it was true. Despite the intensity of those green eyes and the sharp intelligence behind them, he felt more comfortable talking to Grace than he had with anyone in years. "No," she asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. "That is good to know." After that day, something shifted between them. It was not quite friendship and not yet romance, but something in between. Dalton found himself making legitimate excuses to see her. He brought her fresh beef from his ranch when he had a steer butchered. She loaned him books she thought he might enjoy. They fell into a pattern of having coffee together on Sunday afternoons, when school was not in session, and Dalton could justify taking time away from ranch work. They talked about everything: books and politics and religion and the future of the territory. Grace had opinions on everything, and she was not afraid to argue with him when they disagreed. Dalton found it exhilarating. His previous fiancées had always deferred to him, had always agreed with whatever he said. Grace challenged him, made him think, forced him to defend his positions. It was infuriating and addictive in equal measure. The town began to notice. Mrs. Henderson made pointed comments about how the teacher seemed to be keeping company with the rancher. Thomas Pritchard's wife mentioned to Grace that it was nice to see Mr. Brooks smiling again. The gossip was not unkind, but it was persistent, and both Dalton and Grace were aware of it. One Sunday in early May, they went for a walk along the Gunnison River that flowed near Delta. The cottonwoods were leafing out and wildflowers dotted the banks. It was warm enough that Grace had left her shawl at home, and Dalton had rolled up his shirt sleeves. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, just enjoying the spring day. "I have been thinking about staying," Grace said suddenly. "I mean, staying in Delta permanently, not just for this school year." Dalton's heart jumped, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. "That would be good. The town needs a good teacher." "I like it here," Grace continued. "Despite Mrs. Henderson and Frank Martin and all the rest. I like the mountains. I like the pace of life. I even like the school, which is more than I could say about some of the places I have taught." "What made the difference?" Dalton asked. Grace stopped walking and turned to look at him. "Honestly, knowing I have a friend here, someone I can talk to, that makes everything else bearable." The word friend should have been comforting, but instead it felt limiting. Dalton realized with a jolt that he did not want to be just Grace's friend. He wanted more than that. But the memory of standing at that altar twice, of being humiliated and left behind, held him back. "I am glad you feel that way," he said carefully. "Your friendship means a great deal to me as well." Something flickered across Grace's face, too quick for him to read, and then she smiled and resumed walking. They talked about other things for the rest of the afternoon, but Dalton could not shake the feeling that he had missed an important moment, that he had failed some test he had not known he was taking. The weeks rolled into summer. School let out, but Grace stayed in Delta, using the time to prepare curriculum for the next year and to explore the surrounding area. Dalton invited her out to his ranch, and she came on a Saturday morning, riding a horse borrowed from the livery stable. The ranch impressed her, Dalton could tell. He showed her the herds, the new barn he was building, the irrigated fields where he grew hay for winter feed. His hands tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her, and she greeted each of them by name, remembering details about their families that Dalton had mentioned in passing weeks before. "This is impressive," Grace said as they stood on a rise overlooking the property. "You built all this yourself?" "With a lot of help," Dalton said. "But yes, I started with 160 acres and a tent. Now I have 3,000 acres and 50 head of cattle." "You should be proud," Grace said. "This represents years of hard work." "It does," Dalton agreed. "But some days I wonder what it is all for. I have no family to leave it to, no children to carry it on. When I am gone, it will just be sold off to whoever offers the most money." Grace was quiet for a moment. "You could change that." "How?" Dalton asked. "You could marry," Grace said, her voice carefully neutral, "have children, create the family you want." Dalton laughed, but it sounded bitter even to his own ears. "I tried that twice, remember? It did not work out well. So you will just give up, Grace challenged, turning to face him. You will let two women who did not appreciate what they had determine the rest of your life. It is not that simple, Dalton said, feeling defensive. Why not? You are kind, hardworking, successful, and decent. Any sensible woman would be lucky to marry you. Then, where is this sensible woman? Dalton asked, his frustration boiling over. Because I sure as hell have not found her. Grace flinched at his tone, and Dalton immediately regretted his harshness. I am sorry. I should not have snapped at you. No, I am the one who should apologize, Grace said. I am pushing where I have no right to push. Your personal life is none of my business. But Dalton realized, standing there on that rise with the wind blowing Grace's hair loose from its pins, and the sun turning everything golden, that he wanted it to be her business. He wanted her to care about his personal life because she was part of it, more than part of it. She had become the center of it without him quite realizing when it happened. Grace, he started to say, but she had already turned away, walking back toward where they had left the horses. That evening, after Grace had ridden back to town, Dalton sat on his porch and forced himself to be honest about what he was feeling. He had fallen in love with Grace Ortiz. Not the sudden, overwhelming infatuation he had felt with Mary Ellen, or the comfortable affection he had convinced himself was enough with Catherine. This was different, deeper, built on months of conversation and shared laughter and mutual respect. He loved her intelligence and her independence, and the way she challenged him to be better. He loved the way she looked at him like he was someone worth knowing, not just a wealthy rancher or a cautionary tale about romantic failure. But the thought of proposing, of standing at that altar a third time, filled him with a terror he could not shake. What if she said no? What if she said yes, and then changed her mind? What if he went through it all again, the planning and the hope and the eventual humiliation? He did not think he could survive it a third time, so he did nothing. He continued to see Grace, continued their Sunday afternoon conversations, continued to pretend that friendship was enough. And if Grace noticed his increased quietness, his tendency to change the subject when conversations got too personal, she did not mention it. August came, bringing heat that shimmered off the valley floor. The school year was about to start again, and Grace was busy preparing. Dalton threw himself into ranch work, often staying out with the herds until long after dark, exhausting himself so thoroughly that he could not lie awake thinking about what he was too afraid to pursue. Then, one Saturday evening, Thomas Pritchard came out to the ranch. Dalton was surprised to see him, as they usually conducted their business in town. Thomas dismounted, accepting the offer of coffee, and the two men sat on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. I will get straight to the point, Thomas said after they had exchanged pleasantries. My nephew is coming to visit from Denver. He is a lawyer, 28 years old, single. I thought I might introduce him to Miss Ortiz. Dalton felt like he had been punched in the stomach. I see. I wanted to tell you first, Thomas continued, watching Dalton carefully. Because the whole town knows you two have become friends, I did not want you to hear about it as gossip. I appreciate that, Dalton managed to say. Is there a reason I should not introduce them? Thomas asked directly. Because if you have an understanding with Miss Ortiz, I will tell my nephew to look elsewhere. Dalton wanted to say yes. He wanted to claim Grace, to tell Thomas to keep his nephew away from her. But what right did he have to do that? He had never told Grace how he felt. He had never given her any indication that he wanted more than friendship. His fear had kept him silent, and now someone else was going to sweep in and offer her the things Dalton was too cowardly to risk. No, Dalton heard himself say. There is no understanding. Miss Ortiz is free to meet whomever she likes. Thomas nodded slowly. All right then. I just wanted to make sure. After Thomas left, Dalton went inside and poured himself a whiskey, then another. He was being a fool, he knew. He should ride into town right now, knock on Grace's door and tell her exactly how he felt. But the memory of that empty church, the pitying looks, the whispers that followed him for months after each failed wedding, paralyzed him. He did not see Grace the next day or the day after that. When he finally went into town on Wednesday for supplies, he saw her walking with a tall, well-dressed man who could only be Thomas's nephew from Denver. The lawyer was clearly educated and handsome, and he was making Grace laugh. Dalton watched from across the street, hidden in the shadow of the general store awning, and felt like his heart was being crushed in a vise. Grace looked up suddenly, her gaze finding his across the distance. Their eyes met, and Dalton saw surprise, then something like hurt flash across her face. She said something to the lawyer and started to walk toward Dalton, but he turned and strode away, unable to face her with all his feelings so close to the surface. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas's nephew, who Dalton learned was named Robert Carson, courted Grace with all the advantages Dalton lacked. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the nicest place in Delta. He brought her flowers and books from Denver. He talked about his successful law practice and his plans for the future. And Grace, to all appearances, was charmed. Dalton avoided town. He threw himself into work with an intensity that worried his men. He snapped at Pete over minor issues and spent long hours alone, riding the property lines or checking on cattle that did not need checking. At night, he sat on his porch and stared at the mountains, and wondered how he had managed to lose something he had never actually had. It was his housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, who finally confronted him. She was a widow from Mexico who cooked and cleaned for him twice a week, and she had a tendency to speak her mind. "You are being a fool," she told him one morning after he had barely touched his breakfast. "Everyone in town knows you love that teacher, everyone except maybe her, because you are too stupid to tell her." "It is not that simple," Dalton said. "It is exactly that simple," Mrs. Rodriguez retorted. "You love her, tell her. What is the worst that can happen?" "She could say no," Dalton said. "She could say yes and then change her mind. She could leave me standing at that altar again. So you would rather lose her without even trying?" Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "That is not the man I thought you were. That is not the man who built this ranch from nothing. That is not the man who stood up to Frank Martin to protect her." "Maybe I am not that man anymore," Dalton said quietly. "Then you should decide what kind of man you want to be," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Because the lawyer from Denver is planning to propose to Miss Ortiz at the church social on Saturday. Thomas told his wife, and she told half the town." Dalton looked up sharply. "He is proposing, already. They have only known each other for 2 weeks. When a man sees what he wants, he goes after it," Mrs. Rodriguez said meaningfully. "Unlike some people. Saturday came too quickly. The church social was the biggest event of the month, with food and music and the whole town in attendance. Dalton had planned to skip it, unable to face watching Robert propose to Grace, but Pete literally threw his good clothes at him and told him that hiding was for cowards. "You have faced down rustlers and wild animals and the United States Army," Pete said. "You can face one church social." So Dalton dressed in his best suit, the same one he had been married in, twice, or almost married in, and rode into town with his heart pounding like a drum. The social was being held in the field behind the church, with tables laden with food and lanterns strung between the trees. It seemed like everyone in Delta was there, dressed in their Sunday best, laughing and talking in the warm evening air. Dalton spotted Grace immediately. She was wearing a dress he had never seen before, deep green that matched her eyes, with her hair arranged in a way that looked both elegant and effortless. She was standing with Robert, and he had her hand in his, talking earnestly about something. Dalton felt sick. He almost turned around and left right then. But then Grace looked up and saw him. Her expression transformed, surprise giving way to something that looked like hope, and she pulled her hand free from Robert's. The lawyer followed her gaze, and his face tightened when he saw Dalton. Thomas Pritchard appeared at Dalton's elbow. "I am glad you came, are you?" Dalton asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "I am," Thomas said seriously. "I like my nephew, but I think he is about to make a mistake, and I think you are too if you let her go without a fight." Before Dalton could respond, the music started, a fiddle and guitar playing a lively tune. People began to dance, and Robert extended his hand to Grace. She took it, but her eyes were still on Dalton as Robert led her to the makeshift dance floor. Dalton watched them dance, watched Robert hold her close and whisper things that made her nod politely, and something in him finally broke. Not broke apart, but broke open, like a dam that had been holding back too much for too long. All his fear, all his caution, all his carefully constructed walls, suddenly seemed ridiculous. Mrs. Rodriguez was right. He was being a fool. He was letting the past control his future, letting two women who had not valued him determine whether he could be loved by someone who might. Grace was worth the risk. She was worth standing at that altar 100 times if necessary. She was worth the possibility of humiliation and heartbreak, and every other terrible thing his imagination had conjured. Because the alternative, living without her, going back to his empty house and his lonely life, was worse than any fear. The song ended, and Robert leaned in to say something to Grace. She shook her head slightly, and Dalton saw Robert frown. Then the lawyer straightened his shoulders, clearly preparing for something important. This was it, Dalton realized. Robert was about to propose right there in front of everyone. Dalton moved without thinking, crossing the field in long strides. He reached Grace and Robert just as the lawyer was dropping to one knee. "Stop," Dalton said. Everyone turned to stare at him. The conversations around them died away. Even the musicians faltered and fell silent. Robert froze, half kneeling, looking up at Dalton with confusion and anger. "What is the meaning of this, Brooks?" Robert demanded. But Dalton was looking at Grace, only at Grace, and what he saw in her face gave him the courage to continue. "I need to talk to you," he said to her. "Please." "Now?" Grace asked, and her voice was shaking slightly. "Right now." "Yes, right now. Before I lose my nerve, before you say yes to someone else when I should have been the one asking." Robert stood up, his face flushing with anger. "You cannot just interrupt like this. I am trying to propose." "I know," Dalton said, still not looking away from Grace. "And I am sorry for the rudeness. But I have been a coward for too long, and if I do not say this now, I never will." "Dalton," Grace whispered, "what are you doing?" "What I should have done months ago," he said. The entire social was watching now, but Dalton did not care. Let them watch. Let them talk. He was done hiding. "I love you, Grace. I have loved you since the day you stood up to Mrs. Henderson with your chin up and fire in your eyes. I have loved you through every conversation, every shared laugh, every moment we have spent together. And I was too much of a fool to tell you because I was afraid of being left again." "You do not have to be afraid," Grace said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "You never had to be afraid with me." "I know that now," Dalton said, "but I let the past control me. I let what happened twice before stop me from telling you that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met. You are brilliant and brave and beautiful, and you make me want to be better than I am. You make me believe that I could be someone worthy of being loved." "You are worthy," Grace said fiercely. "You have always been worthy. Those women were blind and foolish, and you are better off without them." Robert cleared his throat loudly. "This is very touching, but I believe Miss Ortiz and I were in the middle of something." Grace turned to him, and her expression was kind but firm. "Robert, you are a good man, and you will make someone very happy, but that someone is not me. I am sorry. I should never have let things go this far when my heart was already given to someone else." To him. Robert gestured at Dalton with disbelief. To the man who has been left at the altar twice, he is obviously not capable of maintaining a relationship. "He is capable of far more than you know," Grace said sharply, "and I will thank you not to insult him." Robert looked between them, his jaw tight with frustration, then turned and stalked away. The crowd murmured, and Dalton was aware that they had just created enough gossip to last Delta for months. But Grace was stepping closer to him, and nothing else mattered. "You love me?" she asked quietly. "With everything I have," Dalton confirmed. "I know I have nothing unique to offer. Just a ranch and a lot of hard work and a man who has been foolish enough to be left twice. But if you could see past all that, if you could give me a chance, I promise I would spend every day trying to make you happy." "Nothing unique to offer," Grace repeated, and she actually laughed. "Dalton, you offer me everything. A man who sees me for who I am, who respects my mind as much as anything else, who stood up for me when no one else would. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? Is it enough?" Dalton asked, hardly daring to hope. "It is more than enough," Grace said. "It is everything I have wanted and never thought I would find. I love you, Dalton Brooks. I have loved you for months, and I have been waiting for you to see it." "I am a fool," Dalton said. "Yes," Grace agreed, smiling through her tears. "But you are my fool." Then she kissed him, right there in front of the entire town, and Dalton felt like he was flying. Her lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like cider and possibility. When they finally broke apart, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers, even Mrs. Henderson was clapping, though she looked a bit disapproving of such a public display. "I want to do this right," Dalton said, taking Grace's hands in his. "I want to court you properly, and when the time is right, I want to ask you to marry me. But Grace, I need you to know that if you say yes, if we plan a wedding, I am going to be terrified right up until the moment you walk through those church doors. Then I will walk through them quickly," Grace said, "and I will keep walking until I am standing beside you where I belong." Over the next 6 months, Dalton courted Grace the way he should have from the beginning. He took her to dinner and brought her flowers. He read the books she recommended and discussed them with her. He introduced her properly to his ranch hands and made sure everyone knew that she was important to him. They went on long rides through the mountains, picnics by the river, and quiet evenings on his porch watching the sun set. They talked about everything, including the fears that had kept them both guarded. Grace admitted that she had been afraid too, afraid that Dalton saw her as just a friend, afraid that a man of his stature and success would never seriously consider a half-Spanish teacher with no family and no dowry. Dalton told her about the nightmares he still had sometimes, of standing at that altar alone, and Grace held his hand and promised him that she would not just walk through the doors, she would run if she had to. In December, on a cold, clear evening with snow on the mountains, Dalton proposed. He did it on his porch, where they had spent so many hours talking, with no one around but the two of them and the stars overhead. "Grace Ortiz," he said, holding out a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Would you marry me? Would you take a chance on a man who has been left twice but who loves you more than he ever thought possible to love anyone?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. But Dalton, you need to stop defining yourself by what those women did. You were not rejected because you were not worthy. You were set free to find me. They planned the wedding for March, giving themselves time to make sure everything was perfect. Grace insisted on a simple ceremony with just close friends and family, though in a town like Delta, that still meant most of the population. Dalton was nervous as the day approached, but Grace kept her promise to talk him through every moment of fear. The night before the wedding, Dalton sat on his porch alone, looking at the mountains and thinking about the journey that had brought him here. 2 women had left him, and he had thought it meant he was unlovable. But now he understood that they had simply been wrong for him, and he had been wrong for them. Grace was right. He had been set free to find her, and she was worth every moment of pain and loneliness that had come before. March 15, 1886, dawned bright and clear. Dalton dressed in his wedding suit with hands that trembled only slightly. Pete stood up with him as his best man, and they arrived at the church early before anyone else. "Third time is the charm," Pete said, trying to lighten the mood. "It had better be," Dalton replied. "Because I cannot do this again." "You will not have to," Pete assured him. "That woman loves you. I have seen it in the way she looks at you." The church began to fill with guests. Thomas Pritchard was there with his wife, and even his nephew Robert had come, apparently having gotten over his disappointment. Mrs. Henderson arrived, dressed in her finest, and she actually nodded respectfully at Dalton. Frank Martin was not there, but his wife was, and she had told people that Miss Ortiz, soon to be Mrs. Brooks, was the best teacher her boys had ever had. The Reverend took his place. The pianist began to play. And Dalton stood at that altar for the 3rd time, his heart pounding, his palms sweating, every fear he had ever had rising up in his throat. Then the doors opened, and Grace appeared, and every fear evaporated like morning mist. She was wearing a simple cream-colored dress that her landlady's wife had helped her make, with her auburn hair arranged with small white flowers woven through it. She was carrying a bouquet of early spring wildflowers, and she was smiling at him with such joy and certainty that Dalton felt his eyes sting with tears. She did not walk slowly down the aisle. She practically ran just as she had promised, her skirts swishing, her flowers bouncing, her face radiant with happiness. Dalton met her halfway, unable to wait, and took her hand. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came," Grace whispered back. "I love you, you impossible man. Now let us get married before you have a nervous collapse." They walked to the altar together, hand in hand, and the Reverend smiled at them both. "Dearly beloved," he began, and Dalton felt Grace squeeze his hand reassuringly. The ceremony was everything a wedding should be. They said their vows with voices that shook with emotion. They exchanged rings with hands that trembled, and when the Reverend finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Dalton pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her like a drowning man finding air. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and when they finally broke apart, Grace was laughing and crying at the same time. "We did it," she said. "You did it," Dalton corrected. "You showed up. You made it mean something." "We both made it mean something," Grace said firmly. "Because we chose each other, and we kept choosing each other, even when it was scary." The reception was held at the hotel, and it was a raucous, joyful affair. People danced and ate and toasted the happy couple. Mrs. Rodriguez cornered Dalton at one point and said, "See, I told you that you were being a fool. I am always right." "Yes, madam," Dalton agreed. "You are always right." As the evening wore on, Dalton and Grace slipped away from the party, walking through the dark streets of Delta toward Dalton's ranch, which was now their ranch. Grace had resigned from teaching, though she planned to tutor students privately, and had already started talking about starting a lending library for the town. They arrived at the ranch house, and Dalton carried Grace over the threshold, both of them laughing. Inside, Mrs. Rodriguez had left a fire burning in the hearth and lanterns lit throughout the house, making it warm and welcoming. "This is home now," Dalton said, setting Grace down gently. "Home," Grace repeated, looking around. "I like the sound of that." That night, in the privacy of their room, they discovered each other as husband and wife, with tenderness and passion and the joy of two people who had found their place in the world. Afterward, Grace lay in Dalton's arms, her head on his chest, and they talked quietly about the future. "I want children," Grace said. "Is that something you want too?" "Yes," Dalton said immediately. "I want this house full of noise and chaos and love. I want to teach them to ride and watch you teach them to read. I want all of it." "Good," Grace said, snuggling closer. "Because I intend to fill this house with babies and laughter, and all the things that make a life worth living." The first year of their marriage was everything Dalton had dreamed of and more. Grace transformed the ranch house from a bachelor's dwelling into a real home, with curtains on the windows and flowers in vases and books on every available surface. She got along well with the ranch hands, treating them with respect and learning their names and their stories. She even won over old Pete, who had been skeptical about having a woman around but who was soon singing her praises. Grace also continued her work with the community. She set up that lending library in a corner of the general store, donating many of her own books and encouraging others to do the same. She tutored children who were struggling in school, never accepting payment, but often receiving gifts of food or handmade items in return. And she became an advocate for the town's few Mexican families, making sure they had access to education and fair treatment. Dalton discovered that being married to Grace was nothing like what he had imagined marriage would be. She was his partner in every sense of the word. She had opinions about ranch business and was not afraid to share them, and more often than not, her suggestions were good ones. She could ride as well as any of his hands and was not afraid of hard work. But she also knew when to step back and let him handle things, trusting his judgment and expertise. They argued sometimes, passionate discussions about politics or the best way to handle a problem with the ranch. But they always listened to each other and they always made up, often with kisses that led to more. Dalton had never been happier. In the spring of 1887, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton on a bright May morning, standing in the kitchen with a smile that rivaled the sun. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply. Dalton picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down, worried he had been too rough. "Are you all right? Should you be sitting down?" "Do you need anything?" Grace laughed. "I am pregnant, not made of glass. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," Dalton said, his hand going to her still flat stomach. "Not my wife carrying my child." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Grace continued her activities for the first few months, only slowing down when she got too big to comfortably ride. Dalton was attentive to the point of being annoying, constantly asking if she needed anything, if she was tired, if she was comfortable. Grace bore it with good humor, understanding that it came from love and not from a lack of faith in her strength. In November, on a snowy day when the mountains were white and the air was crisp, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Rodriguez and the doctor were there, and Dalton paced the length of the house, wearing a path in the floor. Pete sat with him, offering whiskey that Dalton could not drink because his stomach was in knots. "Women have been doing this forever," Pete repeated Grace's words. "She is strong. She will be fine." "She has to be," Dalton said. "I cannot lose her, I cannot." Hours passed, each one an eternity. Dalton heard sounds from the bedroom that made his heart clench, but every time he tried to go in, Mrs. Rodriguez blocked the door and told him firmly to wait. Then, finally, he heard it, The thin, reedy wail of a baby crying. Dalton's knees nearly buckled with relief. Mrs. Rodriguez emerged a moment later, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is asking for you." Dalton rushed into the bedroom. Grace was propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up when he entered, and her smile was radiant. "Come meet your son," she said. Dalton approached slowly, almost reverently. Grace pulled back the blanket to reveal a tiny red face, scrunched up and angry-looking with a shock of dark hair. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered. "He is," Grace agreed. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Dalton knew exactly what name felt right. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Brooks, after my father." "Daniel," Grace repeated, testing it out. "I like it. Daniel Brooks, welcome to the world." Dalton sat on the edge of the bed, and Grace carefully transferred the baby to his arms. Dalton held his son for the first time, marveling at how tiny he was, how fragile and how absolutely perfect. This was his child, his and Grace's, a new life that they had created together. "Thank you," he said to Grace, his voice rough with emotion. "For what?" she asked. "For everything. For showing up, for loving me, for giving me this." He looked down at Daniel, then back at Grace. "For making my life mean something." "You made my life mean something too," Grace said. "We did that for each other. That is what love is." Daniel was a good baby, or as good as any baby could be. He cried at night and needed constant attention, but he also brought more joy into the house than Dalton had thought possible. Watching Grace with their son, seeing the tenderness with which she cared for him, made Dalton fall in love with her all over again. As Daniel grew, he proved to have his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness. He was walking by 10 months and talking in full sentences by 2 years old. He loved the ranch, loved the animals, and loved following his father around and mimicking everything he did. When Daniel was 3, Grace got pregnant again. This time, Dalton was calmer, though still attentive. He had been through it once before and knew that Grace was strong enough to handle it. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born in the summer of 1891. She was quieter than Daniel had been, with her mother's green eyes and auburn hair. 2 children became 3 when their youngest, a son they named William, was born in 1893. Their house was full of noise and chaos, just as Dalton had wanted. Grace somehow managed to balance motherhood with her other interests, still running the lending library and tutoring students and being an active part of the community. The ranch prospered under Dalton's management. He expanded his herds, bought more land, and became one of the most successful ranchers in the region. But none of his success meant as much as coming home each evening to a house full of laughter, to children who ran to greet him, and to a wife who still looked at him like he was the most important person in her world. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Daniel grew into a serious boy who loved books almost as much as he loved horses. Rose was the peacemaker, always trying to smooth over disputes between her brothers. William was the wild one, always getting into mischief and somehow charming his way out of trouble. Grace and Dalton grew older together, silver appearing in their hair, lines forming around their eyes from years of laughter and sun. But they still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when the children were not looking, and still talked for hours on the porch in the evenings. One night in 1898, when Daniel was 10, Rose was 7, and William was 5, the whole family sat on the porch after dinner. The children were playing in the yard, and Grace was sitting in the rocking chair Dalton had made for her when she was pregnant with Daniel. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Grace asked, watching the children. Sometimes, Dalton admitted. If Mary Ellen or Catherine had actually married me, I would have had a completely different life. Would you have been happy? Grace asked. Dalton considered the question seriously. Maybe, I do not know. I think I would have convinced myself I was happy because I would not have known anything else. But it would not have been this. It would not have been you. I think about the same thing, Grace said. What if I had accepted Robert's proposal before you interrupted? What if I had been too proud or too hurt to forgive you for waiting so long to tell me how you felt? But you did not, Dalton pointed out. And I did tell you, even though I was terrified. We chose each other. We did, Grace agreed. She reached over and took his hand. We chose each other and we kept choosing each other, and that made all the difference. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play as the sun set behind the mountains. Dalton thought about the journey that had brought him here, all the pain and loneliness and fear. He thought about standing at that altar twice, alone and humiliated. And he thought about the third time when Grace had run down the aisle toward him, her face full of joy and certainty. You know what the greatest gift is? Dalton said after a while. What? Grace asked. That I get to keep choosing you every single day for the rest of my life. That I wake up every morning and you are still here, still loving me, still making everything better just by existing. Grace leaned over and kissed him softly. That is my gift too. Every day with you is a gift. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Daniel went off to college in Denver, studying agriculture so he could eventually take over the ranch. Rose discovered a talent for music and convinced her parents to buy a piano, which she practiced for hours every day. William decided he wanted to be a veterinarian, much to everyone's amusement and pride. Grace's lending library grew into an official town library, housed in its own building that the town voted to construct. She served as the librarian, a position she held with pride. She also began writing articles for regional newspapers about education and women's rights, her sharp intelligence and persuasive arguments making her a respected voice. Dalton continued to expand and improve the ranch, but he also made sure to take time for what really mattered. He never missed one of Rose's piano recitals. He helped Daniel learn the business side of ranching, teaching him everything he knew. He took William on calls with the local veterinarian, supporting his son's dreams even though it meant William might not stay on the ranch. In 1905, when Dalton was 52 and Grace was 44, they celebrated their 19th wedding anniversary. Their children, now young adults, threw them a party at the ranch. The house was full of friends and neighbors, people whose lives Grace and Dalton had touched over the years. Thomas Pritchard stood up to give a toast, his face weathered by age but his eyes still sharp. I have known Dalton Brooks for over 25 years, he said. I have watched him build an empire from nothing. I have seen him face disappointment and humiliation and somehow keep going. But the best thing I ever saw him do was interrupt my nephew's proposal to Grace Ortiz. Everyone laughed, even Robert, who was there with his own wife and children. He had married a woman from Denver and was now a judge, and he and Dalton had become friends over the years. That took courage, Thomas continued. The courage to risk everything, to face his fears, to claim what he wanted even though he had been hurt before. And Grace had the courage to choose him, to see past the gossip and the history and recognize a good man when she saw one. They have built a life together that is a testament to what love can do when two people truly choose each other. Grace stood and raised her glass. To choosing each other, she said. Every single day. To choosing each other, the crowd echoed. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the children had gone to bed, Grace and Dalton sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. The mountains were dark shapes against the star-filled sky, and a cool breeze carried the scent of hay and wildflowers. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked. "Not a single one," Dalton said honestly. "Every moment of pain, every moment of fear led me to you. How could I regret that?" "I feel the same way," Grace said. "Everything I went through, all the loneliness and rejection, was worth it because it brought me here. To you, to this life we have built together." "I stood at that altar twice before," Dalton said quietly, repeating words that had haunted him for so many years. "Alone and afraid that I was unlovable. And then you showed up, and you made it all mean something. You showed me that I was not broken or cursed or any of the other things I had told myself. You showed me that I had just been waiting for the right person. And you showed me that I did not have to be alone," Grace replied. "That there was someone out there who would value me for exactly who I am, who would see my independence as a strength rather than a flaw, who would love me not in spite of my differences but because of them." They sat together as the night deepened. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen each other when it was hard, who had built a life together that was richer and fuller than anything they could have imagined. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Dalton aged gracefully together. Daniel married a teacher he met in college and brought her back to Delta, where they built a house on ranch land and began raising their own family. Rose married a musician from Denver and moved to the city, though she visited often and always brought her children to stay at the ranch for long summers. William became a veterinarian as he had planned and opened a practice in Grand Junction, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to build his own life. Grace and Dalton became grandparents, a role they embraced with enthusiasm. Their grandchildren loved visiting the ranch, and Dalton taught them to ride just as he had taught his own children. Grace read to them for hours, instilling in them the same love of learning she had tried to give every student she had ever taught. In 1915, Delta celebrated its 50th anniversary as an incorporated town. There was a big celebration, with speeches and music and a parade. Grace and Dalton were asked to speak about the history of the town, as they were now considered pillars of the community. Dalton stood on the makeshift stage, looking out at the crowd, and he thought about the young man he had been when he first came to this valley. He thought about the pain and the failures and the fear that had nearly kept him from the greatest joy of his life. "This town gave me a second chance," he said. "Actually, it gave me a third chance, and that third chance led me to the love of my life, to a family I cherish, and to a community that has supported us through everything. Delta has been good to us, and I hope we have been able to give something back in return." Grace spoke next, her voice still strong despite her years. "I came to this town as an outsider, a half-breed woman with no family and no prospects beyond a teaching contract. I was met with suspicion and outright hostility by some, but I was also met with kindness and opportunity by others. This town taught me that home is not where you come from, but where you choose to be and where you are chosen in return. It taught me that love is about courage and choice and showing up, even when it is hard. I am grateful for every day I have spent here." The crowd applauded, and Grace and Dalton stepped down from the stage together, hand in hand as always. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, 3 generations brought together by the love that had started with a man brave enough to interrupt a proposal, and a woman brave enough to run down the aisle. As Dalton and Grace grew older, they slowed down but never stopped. They still walked together in the evenings, though their pace was slower. They still sat on the porch and talked, though sometimes they needed blankets even in summer. They still held hands, though their fingers were now gnarled with arthritis. And they still looked at each other with the same love that had brought them together all those years ago. In 1921, on a bright spring morning, Dalton woke to find Grace still asleep beside him. He watched her for a moment, marveling that after 35 years of marriage, the sight of her still made his heart full. Her hair was white now, her face deeply lined, but to him she was just as beautiful as the day she had run down that aisle. She stirred and opened her eyes, smiling when she saw him watching her. "Good morning, my love." "Good morning," he replied, leaning over to kiss her softly. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Grace corrected, as she always did. "We found each other when we both needed finding." They got up and went about their day, moving through the routines they had established over decades. Breakfast together, Dalton checking on the ranch operations that Daniel now largely managed, Grace working on correspondence for the library. Lunch together, then an afternoon rest that had become necessary as they aged. Dinner with whichever children and grandchildren were around, because there was always someone visiting. And then their evening walk, slower now but still sacred. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Grace leaned her head on Dalton's shoulder. "You know what I am most proud of?" she asked. "What?" Dalton replied, his arm around her. "That we kept choosing each other. Through everything. The good times and the hard times, the joy and the sorrow, the easy days and the difficult ones. We kept choosing each other, and that is what made our love last." "That is what I am most proud of too," Dalton agreed. "That and the fact that I finally found the courage to tell you how I felt, that I did not let fear win." "You almost did," Grace reminded him with a gentle tease. "You almost let Robert propose to me." "Do not remind me," Dalton groaned. "That was the worst 2 weeks of my life." "But you did not," Grace said seriously. "When it mattered most, you were brave. You stood up in front of everyone and claimed what you wanted. That took more courage than most people ever have to show." "Only because you were worth it," Dalton said. "You have always been worth it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over them for decades. Dalton thought about his life, about the journey from that lonely man standing at the altar alone to this, surrounded by love and family, and the kind of contentment he had never thought possible. "I love you," he said, the same words he had said countless times, but that never lost their meaning. "I love you too," Grace replied, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Always and forever." And they continued to choose each other day after day, year after year, until the end of their long and happy lives together. They had proven that standing alone at an altar did not have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning, the prelude to something far greater than anything that had come before. Sometimes you had to be left twice to fully appreciate what you had the third time. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right person showed up and made it all mean something, transforming loneliness into love and fear into courage, and an empty life into one overflowing with joy. Their love story became legend in Delta, told and retold to new generations as an example of what was possible when two people were brave enough to risk everything for love. The church where Dalton had stood alone twice became a place of hope rather than humiliation, because it was also where Grace had run down the aisle to meet him, where they had chosen each other in front of everyone, where their life together had truly begun. Years turned into decades, and Dalton and Grace lived to see their children grown and settled, their grandchildren become adults, and even the first of their great-grandchildren. They lived to see the town of Delta grow and prosper, to see the library Grace had started become a cornerstone of the community, To see the ranch Dalton had built become a legacy that would last for generations. And through it all, they remained each other's constant, each other's choice, each other's home. They had started as two lonely people who had learned not to hope for too much, and they had become partners in the truest sense, building a life together that was greater than the sum of its parts. When they were both in their 80s, sitting on that porch they had worn smooth with decades of evenings, Grace turned to Dalton and said, "If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing." "Not even the parts where I was an idiot and waited too long to tell you how I felt?" Dalton asked. "Not even that," Grace confirmed, "because it made the moment you finally did tell me that much sweeter. It made me appreciate what we have even more." "You are too kind to me," Dalton said. "No," Grace disagreed. "I am exactly as kind as you deserve, which is very kind indeed. You are a good man, Dalton Brooks. You always have been. It just took the right person to help you see it." They continued sitting together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky streaked with color. And when the stars came out, brilliant and numberless, Dalton and Grace remained on their porch, holding hands, choosing each other one more time, as they had done every day for more than 50 years. Their story ended as all stories must, but it was a good ending, a happy ending, the kind of ending that only comes from a lifetime of love and commitment and the daily choice to show up for each other. Dalton had stood alone at that altar twice before, humiliated and heartbroken. But Grace had shown up, had run down that aisle toward him, had chosen him when he needed it most. And together, they had built a life that proved love was real, that it was worth fighting for, that it could last. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the failures that came before, but the success that followed. Not the times he stood alone, but the times she showed up and made it all mean something. Not the fear that nearly stopped him, but the courage that pushed him forward. And most of all, not the ending, but the beautiful, messy, joyful, ordinary, extraordinary life they lived together, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, until the very end.